20 to 40 minutes, whatever. And then we have questions and answers and dialogue, and no fisticuffs though. And we finish promptly at 2:15, so people can go on back to work or whatever. So it's over to you, Gerry.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to everyone for coming along to today's seminar. And thanks to TASC and Paul for giving me an opportunity to talk about these issues. And I'd also like to thank TASC for its support for the Pension Policy Research Group over the years in publishing a number of books that we have written and supporting us in issuing briefing papers publicising our ideas. Now, what I want to do in today's presentation, I'll give a description of the pension system before the reforms took place, and I'll outline why I think structural pension reforms was under consideration in the mid 1990s. I'll outline the proposals that were made for reform of both the public and the private pension systems, and give you my view of what I consider to be the outcomes of the reform proposals, with particular attention to who benefited from the tax reliefs that were given on personal pensions. And I'll finish up with some conclusions and policy implications. Now, the Irish pension system in 1998, before the reform took place, was a standard 3-tier system. The first tier was the public pension system, consisting of a means-tested social assistance pension, which you could get at age 66, social insurance pensions in the form of retirement pensions at age 65, for which you had to retire for 1 year from the labour force, and an old age contributory pension at age 66. And then the private pension system had 2 tiers. The occupational tier, consisting of defined benefit and defined contribution schemes, those schemes were governed by trust law. And the third tier, personal pensions, which were only available at that stage to the self-employed in the form of retirement annuity contracts, and they are governed by contract law in distinction to trust law. Now, the reason that there was concern about a reform of the pension system in the early 1990s was that it was viewed that the coverage of the private pension system here was quite low, and that led the Pensions Board to, in 1995, to commission a report from the ESRI on a range of issues relating to occupational and personal pensions. And I was involved in that survey with Brendan Whelan, who was the head of the survey unit at that time. The reason I think there was a focus on private pensions in the early 1990s is likely to have been strongly influenced by the publication of the World Bank report in 1994 called Averting the Old Age Crisis, Policies to Protect the Old and Promote Growth. And that seemed to offer the prospect of having your cake and eat it, that you could both protect the old and what you were doing in doing that would grow the economy. So that was a very attractive prospect if it proved realisable. Now, the ESRI survey was based on a stratified random sample of over 1,000 firms. The response rate on that was 61%, which was a very good response rate, and of 4,000 households with a very good response rate of 81%. The main conclusions in relation to coverage from the survey was that less than half of people at work had any private pension coverage. Employees, just over half of them had coverage. There was much greater coverage in the public sector at over 80%. The coverage in the private sector was less than half of that, at 38%. Quite low coverage for the self-employed, and virtually no coverage for anybody who was not in the labour force or who was unemployed. So, arising out of that survey and other work that had been done, the Department of Social Protection and the Pensions Board launched a National Pensions Policy Initiative in 1996, I think, and where they solicited views from people who were interested in the pension system as to what form the reforms should take. And following that, 2 years later, they issued a report called Securing Retirement Income in 1998. The main policy message that I took from this report was that the public pension system should be restricted to paying modest flat rate benefits. They didn't want an earnings related component or much expansion of the public system. Their hopes were pinned on expanding the private pension system, and that was based on a belief that it would better respond to a challenge of an ageing society than the public system by reducing pension costs, increasing national savings rates, and promoting economic growth. So I have a few quotes here. So the influence of various interested bodies on this. There's a quote from the World Bank report in which the lead author on the World Bank report, Estelle James, in 1995 recommended that there should be mandatory privately managed scheme through personal retirement savings accounts or employer-sponsored pension plans. Paula Flaherty, who was the vice chairman of the Irish Association of Pension Funds, at a seminar on the National Pensions Policy Initiative in 1996, he put forward the industry view that there should be two structures, a personal retirement account and trust schemes, that the personal schemes should be based on trust law rather than contract law, as the retirement annuity contracts were. There's also international interest in what was going on here and what was going on in Europe. And a chap called Adam Lessing, who was the vice president of the European Federation of Investment Funds, gave a paper in Dublin in 1997, in which he started with saying vast sums of money equivalent to a multiple of the current total assets under management in the industry will be invested in new funded schemes, and went on to hope that Europe would go down the same road as the US in personal defined contribution schemes, and that there were large sums of money at stake there, and his hope was that the mutual funds in Europe would get their hands on that. Now, the proposals that were made for reform deal first with the proposals for the public pension system. The main recommendation was that the state pension should be increased from 28% to 34% of gross average industrial earnings to minimise the risk of pensioner poverty. It also recommended that the state pension should be indexed in line with the growth in earnings. And there was a strong recommendation that there should be partially pre-funding for the state pension and public service pensions in the form of a National Pension Reserve Fund. And the intention of that was to put a cap on the exchequer costs of the public pension system at around 4% of GNP. The report in relation to the private pension system, it identified a number of barriers to expansion of the private pension system. The main ones were that they argued there was lack of access to pension tax incentives by lower paid and part-time employees. There was a lack of information on the quality of pension products and on investment and annuity risks for defined contribution plans. And there were high running costs for small employers in offering occupational coverage. So their proposals were that there should be much greater access to a personal pension through a personal retirement savings account, and that these accounts should provide the same tax reliefs as for occupational pensions and retirement annuity contracts. They also interestingly argued that income adequacy was primarily a responsibility of the private pension system, and so the recommendation was that income from all sources in retirement should amount to about 50% of pre-retirement income. And bearing in mind that they had recommended that the public pension system replacement rate should be 34%, the implication was that the private system would replace 16% of gross average earnings, which is a fairly modest, I think, objective. They also laid down fairly specific objectives for the PRSAs. So they argued that they should be low cost relative to other personal pension products. They hoped that the introduction of a new product would open up the market, and that new competitors would, to the existing financial institutions, would come in, and that the PRSAs would be on sale in the post offices and retail outlets, in supermarkets and so forth. They recommended that it should be mandatory on all employees to provide access to a PRSA, but not to contribute to it. And their hope was that while these products would be open to everybody, whether they were in the labour force or not, that the primary market would be employees in employment. They set a target to increase the coverage rate from less than 50% before the reform to 60% over a 10-year period following the introduction of the PRSAs. And they hope that the tax relief for PRSAs would benefit low and middle income earners. So I'll turn now to the outcome of these proposals. I deal first with the outcomes in relation to the public pension system. So this overhead shows what happened to the replacement rate of the state pension since 1997, just before the reform took place. And so you can see here that in 1997 it was just over 28%. It increased very slowly and reached a peak at the financial crisis in 2008, when it actually had surpassed the target of 34%. It was around 37%, and it's remained around that level since then. And I think the increase that it's worth mentioning, I think the increase in the state pension that took place over this period was following lots of representations from community groups and trade unions and other people who are interested in this area. And it's been very important, I think, in the recession that we've gone through for the last 6 years. I think it's a considerable achievement of the Minister for Social Protection to maintain the state pension at this level, and it has, I think, helped a lot of older people to survive the recession. Sorry, I should go back. The bottom set of bars in blue show what the effect was of the increase in the replacement rate was on pensioner poverty. Initially, for the first 3 or 4 years, there was no discernible effect. In fact, the pensioner poverty rate increased fairly dramatically during the boom years, went up from 20% to 40% as a consequence of the people, pensioners not keeping pace with increases in other areas of the economy. But since 2003, it has fallen back quite rapidly, and it's now down to around 10%, and it seems to have stabilised around that level in recent years. So I think these were considerable successes of the public pension system in being able to increase the basic income for pensioners over this period, and cutting the pension and poverty rate considerably over that period. In relation to indexation, I think it's better, I want to take a longer term view here of the indexation issue. I show here what has happened to indexing of the state pension since it was introduced in 1961. And you can see it falls into three periods. From 61 until about 1980, around here, it was maintained at around 25% of average earnings, despite the fact that there's never been a formal commitment by government to index in line with earnings. But implicitly, that's the kind of policy that they have favoured. Around the 1980s, some of the older members of the audience may remember, there were three elections in a 2-year period in which Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were vying for votes, and I think that they used the old age pension as an incentive to voters to vote for them. So that resulted in a considerable increase up to around 32% in the early 1980s, and then it fell back until this policy was introduced in the Pensions Board report of increasing. So you can see the increasing that has taken place there. It's fallen back a little bit in recent years, but it's still at a considerably higher level than it was. And I think that historical importance is very important, because the state pension run on a pay-as-you-go basis can maintain people's pensioners' living standards in line with the growth in the economy. I think the private pension system is not able to do that. I mean, for most private pension systems, when you retire, you get your pension, and it's not then indexed thereafter. So the value of your private pension is likely to fall the longer you are retired. The outcome of the pre-funding of state pensions, a National Pension Reserve Fund was established in 2001 using the proceeds of Telecom Éireann, to which a lot of us contributed to our cost, and there was contributions of 1% of GNP annually into that fund. Now, Mercers were appointed as advisors to the National Pension Reserve Fund, and their advice was that 80% of the equity, 80% of the money should be invested in equities, 20% in bonds. And the National Pension Reserve Fund was widely welcomed by lots of civic organisations in the state, and some economists actually hailed it as one of the best innovations that there had ever been in economic policy in Ireland. Jim Stewart and myself were not in favour of this fund. We argued that it was a high-risk strategy and that there was little evidence, international evidence that funding increases national savings, and there was certainly no studies done in Ireland that would show that kind of relationship existed. The returns on this fund have been very volatile. They lost 30% of the money in 2008. Other years they gained 20%. And since that fund was established, there's been a shift of priorities from focus on these long-term issues to the immediate problems that we're facing now. And the National Pension Reserve Fund has been used to recapitalise the banks, to make contributions to the bailout, and the residual fund will be absorbed by the Strategic Investment Fund to support economic activity and employment. And I think that is a better use of the money than trying to pre-fund. So turning to the private pension system and the outcomes, well, personal retirement savings accounts were established in 2003. Initially in the Pensions Board report, it was recommended that there should only be a standard PRSA, which would be kite marked, to give it a quality standard. But the industry argued against that, and they, as quoted at the bottom here, shows Jill Kirby in an article in Business and Finance following inquiries using the Freedom of Information Act. She established that the pension companies had lobbied hard against maximum charges, and the compromise was the introduction of a standard PRSA and a non-standard PRSA. The charges on the standard PRSA were capped at 5% of contributions, 1% of the fund annual management charges. There were no caps on the non-standard PRSAs, and these charges were not low cost. They were at the top end of established practice in the Irish pensions industry, and they were considerably higher than charges for personal pensions in Poland, Hungary, Sweden, UK and the US. And in relation to the proposal that every employer should be obliged to provide access to this, that wasn't realised either. The blue bar here shows what percentage of firms provided access to a PRSA. In the first year after the PRSAs were introduced, only 40% of firms or employers had made provision, and that increased very slowly. It's now around 50%, somewhat under 50%. Very few. There's very few of these firms in which employees are actually contributing. The red bar shows the build-up here. It's around somewhat less than 10% of firms have employees who are contributing to these funds. And the primary market for PRSAs did not turn out to be employees who did not have occupational pension coverage. The blue bar here shows what percentage of employees are contributing to a PRSA. It built up, of course, from zero very slowly, but it's now around 3% of employees are contributing. The main market has turned out, as shown in the red line, the main market has turned out to be self-employed people and people who are not in the labour force, and around 10% of that category are contributing to these PRSAs. In relation to income adequacy, the Pensions Board, in making this recommendation about 50%, noted that there was research into actual replacement rates experience at retirement is not available. And so they set, I think, a very modest target of 50%. Other countries, so for example the US, economists would argue that the replacement rate should be 70 to 75%. But anyway, that was the modest target that was set. The only research I think that's been done on these replacement rates was a piece of work Dorothy Watson and I did for the ESRI in 2005, where we used the living in Ireland data from 1994 to 2000. There was a question in that about people who were in their first year of retirement, what their income was, and because of the panel nature of this survey, you can find out what their income was in the year before they retired. That wasn't possible for people who had been retired longer than 1 year. But that research showed that in the first year of retirement, the target was achieved. But of course, on the nature of averages, that means a considerable number of people fell below that level. And given the fact, as I've already mentioned, that private pensions are unlikely to be indexed after retirement, people who have been retired more than 1 year, a considerable number of them, I think, would have fallen below the target. It's also interesting to note that the Pensions Board carried out a review of these proposals in the 1998 report, in a report in 2005. and they noted that defined benefit schemes with higher benefits were being replaced by defined contribution schemes with lower benefits, and so their view was that adequacy may well be deteriorating. They also argued that, as I mentioned, I think that adequacy should be primarily a private sector issue, which I would contest based on the information given in this overhead. I'm looking here at how many people receive income from different sources. So the second column there shows the position in 2005, which is the latest data. The latest data could get this data for 92% of pensioners received an income from social welfare pensions. Only 30% had a private pension, but the social welfare pension was by far the most important. It provided 57% of pensioners' incomes in 2004, whereas the private pension system provided only 16%. And the public pension system has become even more important in the recession years that we're currently going through. So it has increased from 57 to 63%. It's now is very nearly providing 2/3 of all pensioners' income. So I think that we have to have regard to the public pension system in addressing this issue of adequacy. In relation to the other objectives, no new providers entered the market, and these products were not available in the post office or in your local supermarket. In relation to the coverage target, the CSO carried out a survey before the PRSAs were introduced in 2003. Their survey was carried out at the beginning of 2002, and it showed that the private pension coverage rate at that stage was 51.2%. It was virtually the same 7 years later when the last survey of coverage was carried out at the end of 2009. So there's been no impact of these personal pensions on coverage. What seems to have happened is that they have been substituted for occupational pensions in the form of defined benefit or defined contribution. And it's likely that the quality of the product is much less than would have been available through an occupational scheme. Who benefits from the tax reliefs? Well, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that it was the top income groups, as they were already benefiting from the tax reliefs on the occupational scheme. And I show here the only data we have for this is the tax reliefs to self-employed and people who are not in the labour force, because they have to complete a personal income tax return, whereas employees don't show their pension contributions separately. But what that shows is that the 60% of the tax reliefs accrued to people who are in the top income quintile earning over 100,000 euros. Less than 2% of the tax reliefs accrued to people in the bottom income quintile earning 27,000 euros or less. Now, there has been a considerable shift in terms of the private pension system, and I show some data here to document that. In 1990, the blue bar shows that the cost of social welfare pensions for retirement were around 3% of GNP. The cost of the tax expenditures for a private pension system was less than 1%. And in all, we were spending less than 4% of GNP on supporting these pension systems. There's been some increase in that. On the public side in 2009, we were spending around 3.5%, but there was a much bigger increase in the cost of the tax reliefs for the private pension system, the cost of that doubled to more than over 2% of GNP. And in total, we're now spending around 5.5% of GNP on supporting the public and the private pension system. Now, while I've concentrated on the specific proposals in the Pensions Board report on personal pensions, I think we have to have regard to the fact that other outcomes of great reliance on the private pension system have not been good, specifically in relation to the second tier occupational pensions. There has been virtually a collapse in the defined benefit schemes. At the end of 2012, the Pensions Board report documents that 80% of the defined benefit schemes were in deficit. And there are huge deficits in these funds. For example, the Aer Lingus Dublin Airport Authority scheme is in deficit to 780 million, and that's why we're facing into a strike over the St. Patrick's weekend. The Foss Pension Fund was over 300 million in deficit. The Waterford Glass Fund deficit on wind-up was 100 million, and members received only 1/5 to one third of their expected benefits. And that is the reason why they took their case to the European Court of Justice and got a judgment that the Irish government should have introduced a pension protection fund at the same time as the UK had on foot of a similar case. And that judgment also said that they should get substantially all of the promises that had been made to them. In the UK, under the Pension Protection Fund, people in insolvent companies, I think, would be entitled to 90% of the benefits that were promised. What was even more shocking, I think, to me at any rate, was that members of solvent companies were not protected from reductions in benefits. There was, I think, a widespread assumption that you had, in a defined benefit scheme, you would have legal protection, and that the employer would be obliged to make up a deficit. But the SR Technics case, in which the Swiss parent company refused to make up a deficit in the pensions scheme of the branch plant here, undermined that. And that has gone further now, that in the recent social welfare bill that was published, pensioners no longer have priority in solvent companies, and the pension can be reduced from 10 to 20% if the trustees judge, in conjunction with the pensions board, that that's necessary. So my conclusions are that really favouring private pensions has failed to increase coverage, to provide secure or adequate private pensions, and it's shifted costs from and the risks from employers to employees. You'll remember that the previous government brought forward a national pension framework before they went out of office, in which they proposed that there should be a further expansion of the private system in the form of auto-enrolment by employees in these schemes. And I think that ignores, what's happened, the failure of the private pension system, and proposing to use tax reliefs to encourage people to stay in these auto-enrolment schemes, I think would reward the most incompetent pension industry in the OECD. I mean, the reason I say that is that the pensions industry was warned before the crash, 3 or 4 years before the crash, by the Pensions Board in its annual report, that they were overexposed in the equity market, and they ignored that advice. Consequently, they lost nearly 40% of the money in the crash of 2008, which was a much greater percentage loss than any other OECD countries. for which we have data, and there's data on the experience, I think, in 35 OECD countries in that crisis. So my view, and that of the Pension Policy Research Group, which has contributed to this debate over the year, is that we should build upon what works by making the state pension a universal scheme and improving its benefits on a revenue neutral basis. And that the ESRI did take up this issue, and they looked at this proposal in 2006, and where they looked at also increasing the state pension by €50, which would have brought it up to approximately 40% of average earnings. Standardising the pension tax reliefs would have yielded €1.5 billion, and the cost of increasing the pension by €50 at that stage would have been only around half of that. And that figure is in social justice has carried out a costing of a universal pension scheme. They show that the additional cost would be around 0.7 billion, and they also do a long-term analysis, because there's a lot of criticism, I think, about what's judged to be the sustainability of the state pension scheme. Lots of people are arguing that it's not sustainable, even at its modest levels now. But their report, I think, shows that in the long term, paying for a universal pension scheme would be no more difficult than funding existing arrangements, because the social insurance system, even though its coverage is very high, it will become almost universal by the end of, say, the projection period that they were dealing with in 2040. So, thanks for your attention.
Okay, thanks very much, Gerry. That's a tour de force and a great history of the pensions industry in recent years.